regard. What I'd like to do, though, is introduce Jennifer Ponce de León, whom most of you have already met both personally, and then she helped facilitate the opening discussion that we had, I guess, 2 weeks ago. Jennifer is an assistant professor in the Department of English at the University of Pennsylvania. She works on the relationship between radical social movements, cultural movements, and has a kind of transcultural perspective moving between Latin America and North America. The work that she's going to share with us today is part of a larger book project. And what we decided would perhaps make the most sense is for her to begin by introducing some of the general ideas and situate the pre-circulated paper in relationship to the overall book project, and then use this as a springboard for generating a kind of larger conversation about the issues that have been invoked. So with no further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Gabriel, for having me, and thank you all very much for reading the essay that I circulated. As Gabriel mentioned, it's taken from a book that I'm currently finishing, so I'm really looking forward to questions, feedback, discussing any of the ideas in it with you guys today. I'm going to talking more about my methodology and kind of the larger questions in the book, not so much about that essay in particular, but then when we open up for discussion, we can also talk more specifically about the essay that you read. Am I loud enough in the back? Can you hear me? No? Okay. I'll speak louder. So I've been doing research since 2001 on leftist visual art, performance, and literature in the Americas. My research is mainly focused on Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, and the US, and within the US I most specifically work on US Latino cultural production and social movements. So the essay you read is from my book, Radical Politics Across the Arts of the Americas, Experimentation and Engagement in the New Millennium. And I think of this book as a kind of transnational cartography of guerrilla warfare in namely Argentina, Mexico, and the US from the past 2 decades. In it, I theorize a transnational generation of cultural producers who I argue constitute an anti-capitalist, anti-colonial cultural left. And I'm looking at the way that their work participates in social critiques that have been brought about through social critiques of transformations that have been brought about through the deepening of neoliberalization in these contexts at different scales, be these transnational scales, local scales, or at the national level. And part of my project is arguing that that subaltern movements and popular politics that had been at the forefront of resistance to neoliberalization and its effects have had a very formative influence, both politically and aesthetically, on the cultural production that I'm looking at. And I think on cultural production, leftist cultural production much more broadly. So it's really looking at subaltern movements, popular movements, as a very broad cultural force. And more precisely, I'm analyzing artistic practices as they are enmeshed in larger communities of cultural practice, which includes the collective labor of social movements. So like other theorists whose approaches to the study of culture is participating in materialist intellectual traditions, I understand art to be a social phenomena whose social meanings and effects are realized in the material processes that constitute its social life, including production, circulation, and reception. And so in my book, I'm specifically analyzing ephemeral artistic interventions whose social life, in this sense, has been enmeshed with anti-systemic social movements. And I examine how, through their engagement in struggles in and over culture and ideology, which again are always struggles over power, these art practices are participating in the collective labor that movements carry out in multiple social sites to transform life and also transform the ways that social life is understood. And I'm arguing that because the art and the literature that I analyze addresses histories and practices of subaltern collectivities, and in most cases is also materially articulated with forms of subaltern politics, it offers a valuable lens for thinking about forms of domination that are exercised through formulations of national identity and citizenship. It also offers a very valuable lens for looking at the silencing enacted by dominant historical narratives, and also the epistemic limits of Eurocentric humanism. I also argue that because this work aesthetically materializes cultural dimensions of anti-systemic struggles, it helps to bring into view political imaginaries that are operative within these struggles, that are oftentimes erased when these struggles are reduced to are read through purely representational frameworks of liberal politics most generally. And these political imaginaries that I'm talking about include alternative conceptualizations of justice, geopolitics, territory, history, and alternate ideas of futurity. So in this way, I'm using politicized cultural production as a lens to analyze aspects of popular struggle that often fall outside the representational frameworks that are imposed on them. For example, I argue that cultural production aligned with anti-systemic struggles participates in their production of political subjectivities, and it moreover provides an archive or a repertoire of expressive practices in which these can be discerned. This is particularly important, I think, given that emergent counter-hegemonic political imaginaries and subjectivities are so often swiftly effaced and misrepresented by state narratives and the kind of representational frameworks that are fitted to the exigencies of state politics. One might think, for example, of how quickly radical movements are belittled or dismissed if they don't articulate demands or make those, circulate those, how the politics are so often oversimplified and read in kind of a monological vein. And even this, ubiquitous idea that if they don't translate their activity into state reform or demands for state reform, or express what they're doing in those terms, that they've somehow failed. So I would argue that in many cases, these ways of representing anti-systemic movements participate in counterinsurgent politics, but on an ideological plane. And I think the corporate media, as well as academic discourse, are major agents in this onslaught. I've looked at that particularly in regard to the historicization of radical anti-racist movements in the U.S. From the 60s and kind of their being enfolded into narratives of liberal identity politics, for example. So my own approach to analyzing artistic production as it is related to anti-systemic movements is very explicitly pitched against these reductivist and state-centered representations of movements. And I'm reading art that comes from these contexts for how it sheds light on the politics of subjectivation movements entail, their autonomous and utopic dimensions, as well as the dissidence and dissent that exists within them and that attends their afterlives and their historicization. So methodologically, I'm working from the idea that practices of social critique and artistic expression are social phenomena. And so this serves as a basis for examining how political aesthetic practices are co-produced by artists and by other actors who are brought together in social struggles. My analysis is also grounded in an understanding of contemporary social movements as heterogeneous assemblages that affect social life across many different sites. And that means that they can't, again, I'm working against this idea that not only can they not be flattened into kind of representational paradigms and demands, but also moving away from thinking about them as they're associated with singular organizations or leaders. Furthermore, and as I discussed in the essay you read, I'm very interested in the heterogeneity of movements and the kind of, oftentimes they're more radical dimensions that may be kind of a minor chord within them that isn't oftentimes what's always immediately read in them or kind of the focus of their historicization, but is, I think, in the case of the human rights struggle, for example, in Argentina, is a potential within them and is a more radical tendency that exists within movements that are very, very heterogeneous. So this, and I think what's really important about recognizing this internal heterogeneity, it means that these movements' social potential is undetermined and that it itself can be transformed and that it is itself, that kind of the actions of movements, their strategies and their political horizons are themselves sites of struggle. And again, I think that's also the case when we're talking about their historicization. So I'm building on a cross-disciplinary body of scholarship on on the cultural politics of social movements, as well as my own extensive interviews with cultural workers and activists. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I do a lot of ethnography, and I've done a lot of interviews with people, the people I write about, as well as kind of people in their milieu. And so when I'm talking about the cultural politics of movements, and there's an extensive and very rich body of literature on this, what I'm referring to is the ways that movements engage in struggles over representation, ideology, epistemologies, social narratives, memory, space, the organization of desire, modes of sociality. All of these things are, of course, inherently tied up with relations of power, and none of them can be separated from material concerns. But with a focus on the kind of these cultural dimensions of movements, I'm analyzing expressive practices, including artistic practices, as immanent to this dimension of movements. So not that art represents something about a movement, but that it can be, in the case of the work I'm looking at, immanent to these collective processes that movements are producing. Now, as I mentioned, I'm specifically focused on political and aesthetic practices that are anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist in their politics, though they are oftentimes embedded in movements that are quite ideologically heterogeneous. So through my reading of these artistic practices, I'm looking at this heterogeneity, which oftentimes entails dissensus and contradiction within the movements themselves, be that about larger strategies or about their relationship to state politics. And I'm interested particularly in kind of the archive and the repertoire that these artistic practices produce that allows us to have a kind of a more nuanced reading of the movements that oftentimes works against kind of monological representations of them. I'm talking about the work that I research as a kind of guerrilla cultural warfare for a couple reasons. One of them because of its critical relationship to cultural institutions. So most of the practices that I examine are extra-institutional, or they are also part of a counter-institutional practice. So they are themselves founding alternate modes of production, circulation outside of the institutions that are set up to capture this activity. I also refer to this work as guerrilla cultural warfare because it often, in the guerrilla sense, because it often effaces the signal system through which it would be immediately apprehended as art or as literature, and therefore accordingly read in specific ways and accorded certain forms of symbolic value. For example, the work that you read about, that I talked about in the essay on counter-hegemonic aesthetics of history, much of that work is was not immediately read as being art, and a lot of the kind of documentation of it existed on the politics pages of the newspaper, not in art criticism. And it was actually, took many, many years for this work to kind of be taken up in discussions of contemporary art or political art or be shown in cultural institutions, and that really wasn't its immediate aim. And it kind of has multiple lives as a form of cultural activism, for some people as a form of art, for some people it's just protest. But I'm interested in the fact that this work lives in the world in a way that does not immediately announce itself as art. And basically, I'm interested in that because I think a lot of these practices recuperate art as a mode of production that is not principally oriented towards recognition by cultural institutions or by their discursive frameworks, and that it resists the abstraction and decontextualization that these institutions often exercise over cultural production. So rather than valorize a rejection of institutions per se, I'm looking also at artists' specific critiques of cultural institutions of all sorts. So that includes like the Fine Arts Museum that you read about in that essay. It includes anthropology museums. It includes kind of public history as a state project. So I'm looking at very specific critiques of these cultural institutions as ideological state apparatuses. And I'm looking at the ways that extra-institutional practices critically negotiate their own position and representation in relationship to institutional discourses. Be these discourses of liberal and neoliberal multiculturalism, which so overdetermine a lot of the cultural institutions, in the US and in Mexico, just as in my case studies, or negotiating institutional discourses of indigenismo and multiculturalism, neoliberal multiculturalism in Mexico, national narratives that are deployed in cultural heritage sites, or in the context of Argentina, state narratives that are deployed through memory institutes that are dedicated to histories of state terror. So I'm interested in a critical apprehension among cultural producers of the ways that cultural institutions, including those that are represented as beneficent or even progressive, function as porticos for the naturalization of state narratives, and that they essentially translate history into nature. I'm also interested in thinking about the ways that cultural producers find alternate ways of producing and disseminating their work and connecting to counter publics that are convoked and formed by leftist social struggles. So as I noted in my book, in the book I'm examining movements and aesthetics from the 1990s to the present. You read a bit about one of my case studies, which is on political street art in Argentina. In that kind of section of the book, which focuses on Argentina, there's also a study of a counter cartography collective that does a lot of work kind of drawing from popular education methodology, and has produced work that I think has made visible some of the very important critiques of the progressive populist state regimes in Latin America in regard to their extractivist policies and the ecological destruction and territorial displacement that that has entailed. And I also look at another movement called the Transnational Errorista, which is a continuation of the group, etc., that you read about, but is really looking at the effects of counter-terrorist discourse and policy in a national context, but also an international context. So looking at kind of how the war on terror and the promotion of anti-terrorist laws by the US in Latin America has very specific effects in terms of the criminalization of social protest and the criminalization basically of the organized urban poor. In the latter half, the second half of the book, my case studies are Mexican and Chicano artists and writers who work in the US, but who all have a transnational kind of circulation of their work or analysis of what their work means, being Mexicano or Chicano. And I'm looking at, in one case, a project called the Pocho Research Society for Erased and Invisible History. That's a kind of semi-fictionalized counter-institution dealing with otherwise erased subaltern histories in Los Angeles and the Southwest US. I'm also looking at the work of the queer Mexicano playwright Ricardo Gracho and media artist and writer Fran Illich's work. So and I can say that the social critique and the alternative political imaginaries that I'm looking at in all of this work across these different sites are really tied to a particular historical conjuncture, which we could describe in very broad terms as kind of the deepening of neoliberalization and its crises. But of course, the local and national ramifications of these processes are very important, and they're different in these different sites. But for me, it's very important to emphasize that there is a transnational dimension to these processes. So looking at, how, for example, displacement is working in Los Angeles and Chiapas, or in northern Argentina, that there are connections, and that it's an important project to think of those connections, and also then think, therefore, of the solidarities that can exist among the struggles around them. So I want to just kind of, in the last few minutes, to, having given you a very broad overview of the project, to highlight what I think are some of the really important critiques that are coming out of the work that I'm looking at, both in terms of the movements and then the cultural activism that's related to these movements. I think one of these, and I mentioned this in the article that you read, is a very trenchant critique of the liberal technocratic ideology that represents the economy as autonomous of politics, such that the social reality that's created through top-down class warfare on a global scale seems to be a natural product of market forces, and therefore seems to be the kind of only possible reality. This is exemplified, for example, in the essay, particularly I think the last section of the essay that you read, where there's an enormous effort to really look at the role of the state, in this case of state violence, in really creating the conditions that allow for neoliberalization in the case of Argentina, and thus created the contemporary social order. This is also related to the critique of representation of the state as a nonviolent actor, which runs through a lot of the work that I'm looking at. When, of course, the class, like the workings of capital, rely fundamentally on state violence. This critique, I think, is particularly important in the post-dictatorial Latin American context, which I mentioned which I addressed in the essay, where in discourses of transition have worked to represent the neoliberal democratic state as somehow post-violent, as having transcended a preceding stage of armed struggle, counter-revolutionary violence, and authoritarianism. And these narratives that attempt to basically delimit organized violence to authoritarian or neo-fascist regimes, thus separating it from these regimes' neoliberal successors, essentially are trying to represent violence as kind of the exceptional excesses of illiberal regimes rather than just more brutal expressions of liberal agency. So in my research, challenges to this narrative come in the form of work that radicalizes the human rights discourse to highlight the ways that the ruling class makes use of state violence, including state terrorism, for projects that can be understood from the perspective of the working and popular classes as economic terrorism. This work, I think, also brings into view forms of state-sanctioned, class-based violence practiced by neoliberal and even populist progressive regimes, which is far less visible than the recognized political violence of earlier decades. And this is often because it is exacted on subjects whose social marginalization and oftentimes criminalization renders invisible or seemingly legitimate the violence that's enacted upon them. It's also the case with those with the kind of surplus populations that have been rendered redundant to national economies by neoliberal policies, and who are concomitantly seen as a potential problem for governability, and therefore oftentimes the targets of state violence for that reason. This and the invisibilization of these other forms of state-sanctioned or state-led violence, I think, are also related to the way that it is forms of violence that are oftentimes not recognized as such, or whose causes are obfuscated, like the violence of territorial displacement, of debt, or of ecological destruction. Another important aspect of my project is the critique of modes of representation that offer promises of inclusion into a national citizenry or state narrative, while fundamentally actually working as modes of governance that aim to neutralize radical critiques, inoculate against material social change, while laying claim oftentimes to the political capital of subaltern subjects or popular movements. So I look at the way that this occurs in Latin American context through redemptionist state narratives that attempt to close a past chapter of political violence, be this colonial or counter-revolutionary violence, without actually reckoning with the fact that the current social structure has been built upon this violence, and also allowing the ongoing beneficiaries of this violence to oftentimes cleanse their consciousness through kind of participation in these redemptionist narratives. I look at how this operates in the context of the Argentine national culture under Kirchnerism, that's the progressive populist regime of the 2000s, with the state's adoption of the discourse of the human rights movement. And I highlight leftist critiques of this process that have been articulated by autonomous cultural activists, which is actually in contradistinction to the position that was taken up by many of the flagship leftist human rights organizations like the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. That is kind of a latter part of continuation of the study that you read that actually looks at the relationship between the state and the human rights movement in the decade following the essay, the period that's addressed in the essay you read. Another very important part of my project is a critique of liberal and neoliberal multicultural discourses in the US and in Mexico. So within the discourses I examine, the limited representation of minorities who are recognized according to identitarian categories that are themselves colonial products works hand in hand with the reproduction of social hierarchies, the reproduction of their unquestioned and unmarked master signifiers, and ultimately with the continuation of colonialist and capitalist processes of dispossession. So part of my project is essentially a transnational analysis of state multiculturalist discourses as they work to update and also conceal forms of domination. Related to this is the analysis of critiques coming out of social movements and leftist cultural practice that's looking at ongoing colonial and imperial processes of dispossession as they are inherent to contemporary financialized and globalized regimes of accumulation. Here, the knowledge production by indigenous movements and other subaltern territorial-based movements has been especially important for building awareness of these processes and for bringing into view the colonial epistemologies that naturalize or legitimate ongoing territorial conquest, and that naturalize, hand in hand with this, the ongoing objectification of nature, the treatment of the environment and non-human animals as resources. So in this one case study that really focuses on this, I'm looking at media art by Fran Illich that is influenced by and very much aligned with the Zapatistas, internationalist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist politics. I specifically analyze an anti-humanist, anti-colonial alternate reality game that he produced. And through that analysis, I theorize what I call a stereoscopic anti-colonial aesthetics as one that brings into view both the materiality of contemporary colonial practices and their systemic disavowal. And therefore, it puts into relief the ways in which coloniality functions as an epistemic project that enables the proliferation of universalist ideologies and moral economies that are organized around systemic effacements. My research on that particular project considers the colonial character of museums, of neoliberal economic regimes, as well as the geopolitical determinations that define at an ideological level what debt and property are, as well as there's a very strong critique in that project of the provincialism of Eurocentric humanism's universalizing claims and the kind of moral feelings that are founded upon these. This work, I'm also looking at the ways that metropolitan cultural producers might articulate our cultural work with liberation struggles, not only in a kind of discursive sense, but also materially. Finally, in my project, there's a kind of ongoing concern with illegible archives and erased histories, and with the politics of historical production, particularly as it works to foreclose radical traditions of critique and political practice and consign them, in ideology at least, to the past. I argue that expressive practices that are embedded in or aligned with radical social movements can bring into view counter-hegemonic political imaginaries and look beyond the kind of ideological enclosures that oftentimes are effected through historical production and that are essentially themselves part of the global project of capital insofar as they make desires for radical social transformation seem anachronistic or hopelessly idealistic. So with that, I'm going to close. I think I gave you a kind of broad overview of some of the major claims in my book, and then we'll discuss
we can tease out
detail, and then
obviously people should jump in as they see fit. I may just begin getting the conversation rolling by kind of querying you on the transnational dimension of your research and why it is that, on the one hand, it's important to do that, and it's a transnational analysis that at the same time is really structured around a north-south axis, both geographically and historically, it seems to me. And so the most general question is, well, why is it necessary to do that as opposed to just look at what cultural producers are doing within a particular site, such as a state? But then the corresponding question would be that a lot of the ways in which the vocabulary of transnational is used is to index a process of globalization in which nation-state actors would become kind of secondary, either to global forces of capitalism or to technological developments or things like this. And so how is it that you're thinking the transnational that is not the breakdown of the state? Because it seems like you're saying the opposite, right?
Yeah.
That actually the opposition between globalization and nation state might need to be rethought in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So basically, how can you think the transnational while really insisting on movements that are pitted precisely against nation state actors?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, to start with your first question, I think the why transnational, I'm very invested in what I see as the internationalism of the politics of movements that I'm looking at. And I think that there's been, just in terms of, my work on leftist cultural production, there's a great deal of, scholarship and documentation on how that worked in terms of radical politics in the 60s and 70s, where kind of, leftist discourse of internationalism is, much more widely circulated, and radical cultural producers articulate their practice with movements, oftentimes through, in this case of looking at the 60s and 70s, through revolutionary movements, through communist parties, etc.
Right.
And there's a kind of narrative that says, well, after the end of those movements, or the eclipse of the kind of politics that was dominant in those movements, you just have fragmented local struggles. And I don't think that's the case. I think there's been a lot of really good work on, when I say very good scholarship on, but also the knowledge produced by the movements themselves and their own texts and their own archives that have said, no, these are international struggles against local capital, against international processes of imperialist dispossession. That doesn't mean everybody uses the same language to talk about that, or that these don't have local inscriptions and local struggles. But I think that I'm very interested in highlighting the internationalist dimension that's operative.
Why transnational? Is it just it might just be semantic. Why transnational as opposed to international, right? Because you insist on, in particular, it's a striking expression, right? The transnational guerrilla cultural warfare.
Yeah.
Why not international? Or
well, I think, on one hand, I think internationalism indexes a certain kind, in my mind, a certain kind of radical leftist politics. Transnational in this, transnational is also a way of talking about the social processes that are determining that are creating the conditions out of which the movements that I'm looking at operate. Then those processes are transnational in the sense that they're really about they are about, for example, transnational regimes of financialized capital. They are about transnational migratory flows.
Right.
So I think in that sense, transnational is, and the way that it's used, particularly within my own fields of transnational Latino studies, for example, it has a different meaning in that sense for talking about those processes.
Yeah.
Then you asked a question about the role of the state in this.
Yeah, precisely because it seems that then the state is a central actor. At one point in time you said that the state, through its multicultural modes of representation, seeks to capture or neuter particular movements. And so how is it that you see the state operating not simply in relationship to kind of global neoliberalization, but also then internally in order to neuter movements in various ways?
Mm-hmm.
And why is it that the state actor, on your account, this also relates to one of the main themes, I think, in the piece that you shared with us, is the theme of representation.
Mm-hmm.
And often it's assumed that, well, if you get state representation, if it be political or aesthetic, this is a good thing. Like you vote in a candidate, for instance, or you make a work of art that is actually then shown in a particular museum. And it seems that a lot of your work is actually marshaled precisely against that understanding of what the success of a political or artistic movement would be. And so I'd be curious to hear you more on the centrality of representation, both politically and culturally, and why it is that there is, as you identify, a kind of pernicious mode of representation that actually doesn't give power to that which it represents, but it represents precisely in order to decimate that which it captures.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a bunch of
There's a lot
questions
there.
I mean, I just want to say briefly. I think the kind of idea that neoliberalization has entailed or rollback in the state is completely false. Particularly when understanding how important state violence has been for these projects. And this is something, obvious when you're looking at like the Southern Cone, when you're looking at Latin America. It's also it's very obvious when looking at any kind of repression of indigenous movements, of peasant movements, that there's been the kind of ongoing processes of, basically warfare that have various levels of visibility have been absolutely central to the contemporary regimes of accumulation, as well as, we're just thinking of the U.S., all of the wars in the Middle East, that is the money that's circulating through the global financial system. I think that's really essential. So this idea that somehow the state is not. The other question about representation as a state project, and you wanted to know how that is a kind of capture of these movements.
Yeah, put very simply, often representation is considered to be a political or cultural good. You get representation, meaning that you have power. And it seems that a lot of your work is trying to invert that assumption. And say that representation is neutralization to a certain extent.
Yeah, in many cases, I think that is, now I don't want to say that in a kind of abstract sense. I think it's really important to look at particular historical cases, right? That's an enormous debate in terms of leftist Latin American politics, and I think, and the pink tide, and the achievement of state power in different contexts is very different depending on if you're talking about the U.S., Venezuela, or Bolivia, or Argentina. So I don't want to, make broad statements about these that kind of flatten out all of those differences. In terms of my own research, for example, just to give one example that is one that I think is really important, is looking at the way that radical movements in the U.S., for example, of the 60s, have been, those politics have been kind of translated and neutralized by paradigms of liberal multiculturalism. Is a really important history to attend to, and I think that has operated through state policies. It operates ideologically. It operates through universities and academic discourse. And so what you have in that case is, a history of radical movements, be it a Black Power movement and the Chicano liberation movement, gay liberation, that had internationalist, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial politics who were part of these, global, radical political imaginaries. And in many cases, the very power of those movements is attested to the fact that they were so violently repressed. But there's also, I think, a really important part of kind of understanding that counterinsurgent project is the attempt to neutralize and capture them through liberal multiculturalist politics. And that operates in a lot of different levels. It operates, and I think, and what I've talked a lot about historicization as being part of this counterinsurgent politics. Part of that is then the historicization of those movements as if they were identitarian movements, as if was always their politics, that they were identity politics, which is, I think, in the case of the U.S., has oftentimes meant the kind of imposition on the reading of them of precisely the kind of state politics that is about neutralizing their material demands. And so there's a kind of a way, when you talk about representation, that has meant, in a lot of ways, a kind of disconnection of material demands and demands for real change in relationships of power, and instead having kind of greater representation within institutions that are still controlled by this, the same elites that they were always controlled. But then you kind of allow for kind of limited forms of representation within those.
Right.
I think that's one really important example.
Right.
The case of, let me just give you one other example, the way the indigenismo operates in Latin America is another great example of that, where you have, and most of my research in that case is on Mexico, where you have an enormous state project that's really about representing and managing indigenous people. And you can't just say in this case of saying, well, representation means power, invisibility means disempowerment, because you have huge state projects that really are about, glorifying, making visible certain folkloric ideas of what it means to be Indian, but at the same time, marking the limits of what that can be in the modern state. And so those are also projects of representation that are very much projects of domination at the same time.
Right. I mean, Larry, do you have yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just to follow up on this. I'm not entirely sure if...
And speak up, the acoustics aren't great, so everybody's going to have to yell.
All right, do my best. I don't know if I'm thinking in a different direction than you, and you can tell me if I am. But it seems to me that any form of opposition or resistance to neoliberalism in Latin America is going to sort of come up against the awe-inspiring power that is the IMF and the CIA, i.e. the United States. Right? And it seems to me that if things are actually going to get substantially better in a really profound way, that there's going to have to be something like a unified opposition that might have to look something more like internationalism of the old kind of radical leftist sense. So I'm thinking of things like the Bank of the South, which can be criticized or should be criticized, but I mean, it did make a very big difference. And it required a kind of international, not just international cooperation, but international cooperation with a sort of unified vision for, we don't want this, we want something else. I don't know if at some certain points during your talk, I thought you were heading in that direction, and other points I thought you were pushing away from it.
Well, I think I don't want to say that there's just one kind of internationalism that could exist. I think that, for example, the Bank of the South, all about like those internationalist visions that were articulated by the more radical or more leftist regimes in the Pink Tide, I think, are really important ones, and have I really think brought about among a lot of Latin Americanists a really reconsideration of having to take much more seriously the importance of this state, if not kind of the ultimate horizon of a radical transformation, at very least as a very necessary buffer against U.S. imperialism. So I think that's a very important question. At the same time, again, in the case of Latin American politics, there's a huge difference between these different regimes, and a lot of very important critiques from the left of them, and particularly of the ones that are, have been more centrist. But I'm also thinking of the internationalism, a kind of internationalism from below, like the internationalism of Zapatismo. And their critiques of the colonial state, I think, are really, really important to keep in mind, because this is one of the and that's one of the things that a lot of people have criticized them for not kind of throwing their power behind electoral politics. And I think that's a huge mistake to dismiss them for that reason. For one, because it doesn't take seriously the violence of the colonial state, but also because they really have put into practice another kind of internationalism, another kind of politics that I think have to be really looked at. So I'm also thinking about that. I don't think that internationalism needs to be one that's necessarily we think of as kind of articulated between states.
Carly wanted to.
Yeah. Jennifer, can I just first say I was really grateful to have read this particular essay. I found it really thought-provoking, and although the content is vastly different to what I'm working on, some of the aspects of your analyses I found really insightful and relevant to where I'm at in a different field. So what I'm interested in is kind of more I guess, more methodological perhaps than some of the discussion that we've been having. But I'm really interested in the function of these expressive practices, as you refer to them, in expressing, supporting, furthering political actions and social movements. And in your essay, you talk about how these expressive practices, through their use of temporality and space, kind of insert their viewers into a more present kind of historicity of these different viewings of history, I should say. And in the case of the mapas of the Aquí viven los genocidos, you say that it kind of inserts the viewer in and then has the sort of demand them to take a position and the potential to take action. And then in the case of Los Huellas, you say it demands action of the viewers. And I'm really interested in what your thinking is behind that claim, what you see the relationship between the raising of critical consciousness through these expressive practices and the next step of actually taking a political stance or taking political action, and how you see that whole intersection happening.
Yeah. Well, I think in the case of a lot of the work by, I think, okay, on the question of raising a critical consciousness, in this particular case, what I'm really interested in how they are, making this an issue that exists in the here and now, and says, this is your neighbors, this is your neighborhood, this is the the city that you live in now, which is a really, in this context, I think a really important gesture to make, given how important and how powerful the narratives that have said, well, this is in the past, this is, this chapter is closed. That, I think, is a big part of the kind of critical consciousness. And in terms of taking the next step of taking action, a lot of that in the case of their work has to do with actually creating things that are tools for the organization of these denunciation protests. So the maps, it would be different if these existed in isolation, but they actually exist as part of a movement that has a practice of popular justice where people go and denounce, and actually denounce these people. So that is part of, I think that's necessary for reading the effect of this work, because it is really articulated with this larger activist practice that is about taking action. And this work is itself a form of direct action. So like the Huellas piece, there's an idea of what it does to the viewer, but they themselves are doing an escrache. So it is not just a kind of representation or demand, it itself is the denunciation. And so it's both a denunciation process and a work of art, and that's one of the things that I'm really interested in. It's not kind of relying on an idea of, well, we give you an idea and then somebody will interpret it and take action. This work itself is participating in direct action.
So what do you think that act and that demonstration actually achieves?
Well, yeah.
Really bluntly,
in general, I think the denunciation protests, and there's very good analyses of them by the people who do them and by people, theorists, and so I'm drawing on their work and what they, in some cases it achieves the actual social isolation of these people. People lose their jobs. People have to move to another neighborhood. They talk about it as, wanting to turn the neighborhood into a prison and have these people be socially isolated. So that's one of them. It's like a social punishment, right? I think that's one level. On the other level, it's very important that the sort of the building of a social consensus around this and making this an issue and talking about it with people, making that condemnation of state terrorism and its agents into kind of bringing that into public discourse and developing that discourse at a popular level, I think is very, very important. And I should say, that's not because it's not, there's plenty of apologists for for state terrorism or for a dictator. This is not like a closed issue. It's not like everybody thinks that this was terrible and that these people should be in jail. This is actually a very live issue, especially now in the case of Argentina with the return of the right. There's been a huge assault on the even on the recognition of the history of state terrorism. So bringing this into public discourse itself, I think, is really, or bringing that public discourse into kind of a neighborhood grassroots level is itself, I think, a really important thing.
Can I just ask one more point? First, it was really helpful just hearing you say that about achieving social isolation of the perpetrators and building a social consensus. If we can just go even more zoom into the actual expressive practice and the mental processes that would happen inside the viewer of those expressive practices, whether it's art or whether it's a performance, so to speak. Do you think that one of the ways that they achieve that raising of critical consciousness at an individual level and then building a social consensus is by using symbolism, using art forms that are so well known to the individual, like maps of a neighborhood and like, obviously references to the sugar in the case of that particular community. Do you think that they use these symbols that are so ingrained and so known to the viewers, but overlay a very explicit alternate kind of interpretation of those symbols as a way of kind of short-circuiting or helping the viewer to kind of, it sort of like gets into the viewer's consciousness on a subconscious level almost, but then all of a sudden there's this like disconnect with what they're viewing, and there's a sense of critical consciousness raising that happens when they view it that they can't help but pay attention to. I know I'm getting sort of,
well, I think that's a very
there,
I think that's a really interesting analysis. I think that's a great analysis of it. I mean, I do think that this work is meant to be read and meant to be legible, and that's a big part of it. That it's not, in its conceptualist work, much of it, but it is, asking to, it is making it is highly legible. And I think in like what you're talking about in the case of, for example, the use of maps or the street signs, things like that. I think, again, also the fact that it is not, and I mentioned this before, that it is not kind of presented with a veneer as an art object. That would, I think, be read quite differently. The other thing I just wanted to say that about the effect of it, I think on one hand they talk about the effect in terms of, actually denouncing perpetrators, etc. But I also think there's a very important element that has to, in itself, the very practice of popular justice and the very practice of a non-state oriented conception of justice, that is also really powerful for the kind of critical consciousness raising that it's doing beyond the question of denouncing perpetrators of state terrorism. I think that, and this is something that has been written about in, I think, very important ways, how that practice itself is kind of part of a genealogy of insurrectionary practices that take different forms and have existed in different movements, but that's something, the kind of the practice of direct action in this way, and of the idea that you can have a kind of ethical community that regulates itself, and then it performs that in public space, is a very powerful, in itself is a very, very powerful gesture that I think translates across different types of, political issues, different types of social struggles.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in? So I'm very interested in, I want to ask you if you're invested in a certain notion of the public sphere at a transnational level in your work in terms of the guerrilla culture warfare that you're talking about. That is to say, because you want to resist the recuperation of these social movements, these artistic movements, in terms of liberal multicultural politics and transformative demands, which often happens when you, in terms of the impact of what these groups are trying to achieve. Is it an impact in the sort of public sphere in terms of human rights or a representative logic Or is the effects of these social movements more on the sort of ground level where it doesn't have to produce an effect in some sort of notion of public sphere? So I'm just kind of wondering if there's, if that fits into your thinking at all. So like in that way you're thinking with the transnational public sphere, which kind of can limit the rise of social movements in terms of more radical politics.
Yeah. No, I think I'm honestly, I think the very kind of nature of these movements profoundly puts into question the kind of model of the public sphere. I would say that there's much, this work primarily focuses on what some people talk about as kind of counter-publics, but that the public, we're thinking about the public for this work. That in itself is even a kind of odd term because we're often taught these are kind of more communities in resistance, and so the kind of even the idea that of reception, that the idea of the public kind of suggests, I don't think totally fits with what I'm talking about. But I would say that in terms of their effects, they have many different kinds of effects. Then they circulate, like they have a kind of life that's quite variegated, because on one level you have, okay, well, what happens when you have a denunciation protest for the people who are there? And then you have, well, these movements themselves have their own kind of temporality, their own communities, their own discourses, their own practices that, and then this work circulates in that. It's part of the kind of the cultural transformation that has its own temporality that movement enacts. Then oftentimes it does, in many of these cases, there is a kind of visibility on a national stage, which is different and has a kind of a different reception. Could be quite read in very different ways from what it means for people who are actually part of the movement. And I think that movements are quite savvy about that there are multiple levels of reception, that what might be done kind of within one community that has a shared struggle is different from the face you put for kind of public sphere, or you put for national politics, or you put out for international politics. And so I think you actually have to be very kind of nuanced in reading how even that reception is oftentimes already taken into account at the level of production. And I don't even just mean in terms of what artists produce, but I mean what movements produce. That the kind of awareness that there's many different scales and many different audiences for kind of whatever kind of cultural artifacts or archives are being produced. So in that sense, and so a lot of this work then also, does circulate in sort of other kinds of transnational or translocal networks, and has, in that case, a totally different purpose. Kind of, for example, translocal networks of leftist cultural activists, and it can kind of have that life there also. So I think, I guess part of what I'm saying is I think that it works at many, many different levels, and isn't produced. I don't think it makes sense to say it's, to try and privilege one or say it's produced for just one. But the meaning, it can take on very different meanings in those different contexts. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it
does. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, and I guess maybe this is similar to some of the questions, so sorry if it sounds like a repetition, but I'm wondering if, in looking at these artistic, political practices, right, or social practices, and I guess at some point, interestingly, the line is blurring, right? The question of aesthetics and the term kind of like a counter-hegemonic aesthetics is interesting in the sense that if the idea is that these kind of artistic and social practices are offering kind of a true counter-hegemonic aesthetics in the sense of an ability to perceive counter-hegemonically. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering how, and maybe this is the problem of perception, or the problem of kind of how the ideological state apparatus can capture right? Like inevitably capture these movements. I can imagine, you know, the MoMA doing an exhibit where these are kind of produced and narrated as, you know, actions of human rights, right? So to put it maybe more specifically, like how, in what way, like, in what way can, like, in Scratche, I can see how your reading, and I'm totally with you, like, can find and uncover, and the way that the people who are participating in it have a kind of vision of temporality or a counter-hegemonic vision that, you know, can see that artistic practice as linking, undoing the naturalization of the history from the Argentinian dictatorship to neoliberal violence, right? But I'm wondering if there's a kind of, like, you know, like a kind of, like the dialectical problem, right? Like, in a way, like it's similar to kind of what I'm working on, which we've talked about, right? So how can I talk about artistic texts that deal with narco trafficking in Mexico that are resisting, at times resisting the hegemonic Mexican state discourse, and at times reproducing it, right? And it seems like it's a really hard question because, you know, then these novels become commodities that then, you know, get captured as, you know, kind of like, oh, the Mexican question, it's a human rights issue, right, that falls into the kind of liberal dynamics that we don't want to talk about. So I'm wondering, I don't know, it's like an impasse, I guess, is what I'm trying to express, but I'm asking kind of how you think through that impasse, right? So how is it that, like, other than a kind of, you know, argument about like the producer's intentionality, is there something inherent in the Escrache or these specific artistic practices that is resisting its hegemonic capture? Would be one way to say that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and I think I'll answer most first specifically and then more generally. I'd say in terms of the Escrache, yes, there's something inherent in it because the hegemonic capture is the orientation of human rights struggle towards state reform, or its orientation towards demands to the state. And Escrache, as an act of popular justice, itself is doing something totally different, and it's producing a different type of political subjectivity than one that would, you know, think that the only way that justice can be delivered is that you ask the state institution to deliver it. So yeah, I do think there is something inherent in that. That said, there are people who, you know, do read Escraches as basically just a tactic to push the state, you know, to deliver justice, and in that case would read the, you know, the opening of trials. There is a very important narrative of that, I mean, very influential narrative that would say, well, all of that work of the human rights movement sort of culminates in then Kirchner overturning amnesties and you have some trials. And I think that is, you know, really a mistake to, you know, tell these stories that basically erase transgenerational, decades-long labor of movements and everything else that they built in that process to then say, well, you know, fine, and the state rides in and, you know, delivers justice. That's, I think, a very bad, it erases an enormous amount of everything else that's happening at the same time. That you produce people who think that they can, you know, go and create justice for their own community, for example. The larger question of the kind of, I think, the capture by institutions and things like that, I know, I mean, that is such a common kind of way that we tend to talk about political art, I think, and I think that particularly once it gets recognized or if it gets taken up in kind of, you know, institutionalized circuits, right? That then there's like, well, once it was radical and now it's neutralized. And that is something, of course, that, you know, I've come up against many times in that question, I think is an important one. But I don't want to just kind of give so much power to that reading, because I think oftentimes then it's like we're reading these things through the lens of an institutional actor and kind of effacing all of the other types of publics, all the other forms of reading, other kinds of reading practices that might exist for this work. But I do think that with that in mind, that's why the questions of kind of extra-institutional or counter-institutional practices is a really important one. Because I don't want to say, well, just because something has a kind of, is radical on a representational level, that even if, it just exists at MoMA, it's going to do a lot of work in the world. Not necessarily. I mean, I think we really do have to think about all the, like I said, the conditions of production and circulation of this work, and that those themselves can be kind of forms of capture, right? So in that sense, I'm also really interested in work that is trying to do that differently. And I think that kind of the resistance to the neutralization has to also happen at those levels.
I know that Greg has a question, but just really quickly, if you don't mind, I'd like to follow up on this, because it strikes me that part of the way in which you describe the extra-institutional cultural practices inscribes itself very clearly against, and maybe that's where Jonathan's question is somewhat coming from, an understanding of certain cultural practices as being modalities of institutional critique, in which you would reveal the kind of inner workings of the institutions, whatever they might be. It could be the publishing industry, it could be the museum, it could be the televisual apparatus, and that you reveal at once the contradictions and the way in which they neuter and recuperate various movements. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that, and this is what I'd like to hear more about, when you talk about an extra-institutional cultural practice, that it's not just a practice that could even maybe be shown in the MoMA, just in the sense that there's actually there's the production of alternative communities of aesthetic production. Yeah. And so you literally have to move Argentina and all of these people and all of the history of Argentina and somehow capture that in the MoMA, and it seems actually structurally impossible. Mm-hmm. Whereas with certain forms of institutional critique, you can. So I don't know if...
Yeah. And I think I do think there's a differentiation to be made between forms of institutional critique and then to what you're saying that end up being, that I think are very important, but that can end up being parasitic on the institution. Precisely because they are not forging other, possibilities for, or other kinds of, not institutionalizing themselves along other terms, forms of production, communities of reception, etc. So that is, and I think just in terms of thinking about the history of institutional critique in terms of critical art practice, while very valuable and inspiring, I think is limited in that sense if it's always about, talking to the institution about itself and still allowing those institutions to, organize its production and its reception. And again, I think the other differentiation that I want to make on that line is there is, in terms of thinking of institutional critique, and a lot of important work that is done around, for example, exposing the funding of certain kinds of institutions, sort of demanding certain forms of reform, oftentimes can really misrecognize the ultimate function of these institutions, and sort of demanding them to be more moral or more inclusive, then is a misapprehension of what their actual function is. And I think that has then gets way too much, those kind of demands get way too much play in terms of our discussions around the politics of contemporary cultural production. What I'm much more interested in work that, for one, really apprehends these institutions for what they are, is not asking them, therefore, to be more moral or just more inclusive, but then also that's looking at creating, other kinds of institutions. I think that's a really, that's a project that we should, be invested in and be thinking about and talking about.
Well, I guess my question kind of relates to that last point that you just made, but we saw in your article, we read one particular example of the kinds of aesthetic practices, political practices that groups are undertaking, but one that I'm very interested in and wondering about is what kinds of forms of resistance and projects or what examples do you have of these kinds of projects that specifically resist neoliberalism? I know that obviously the Scarace and the other example are, of course, also related in the form of the state, repression and so on. But I mean, I'm particularly thinking of contemporary practices of neoliberalism, as, for example, the Macri government in Argentina now introducing all these different things, or before that, before Evo Morales was elected in Bolivia, the water protests and so on. If there's any kind of aesthetic practices that go in that direction, and whether they're always purely defensive. I think that's a major issue for progressive movements, is that that they tend to be purely defensive and not really necessarily forward-looking. And so I'm wondering if the kinds of things that you've been looking at, whether there are also examples of forward-looking ones that go beyond being defensive and in terms of creating alternatives or alternative institutions, as you suggested just now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for one, I do think that what the example that I'm talking about in this essay actually is very much resisting the effects of neoliberalization, and insofar as a huge part of that has been the breaking of social ties and the kind of atomization of social subjects, right? That is an enormous part of what that project was and is. And so even this idea of creating communities of resistance, of conceiving of other forms of political practice that are precisely working against that social atomization, I do think is a really important aspect of that resistance to neoliberalization. In its kind of, as it works kind of on the production of subjectivity. That's one way of putting it. I think in the case of some of the other work that I've looked at, I mentioned the Countercartography Collective. They're called the Iconoclastistas, and they've done a lot of work working with this kind of critical mapping projects that have really kind of given visual representations to what the effects of these extractivist industries have been across Latin America, and the kind of the relationship, for example, between mega mining and soy production and territorial displacement, the people who then move to urban slums. So I think that's a huge part, just to kind of looking at some of the political economies that have been of neoliberal modes of accumulation that are really set in kind of put in place in the 90s, but that continue, including under the leftist regimes. I think the other important example in my book, but also I think major touchstone for all of the communities that I'm looking at is Zapatismo and its theorization. It's really proliferating a discourse of a global resistance to neoliberal capital and popularizing that. And I think that it has been a really very valuable form of a kind of internationalism that's not working through the nation state, but that's been explicitly about resisting neoliberal capital. But also I think what's really important about that, and this comes through in the case study that I look at, the kind of the cultural production that's related to it, in understanding it as a colonial project, right? And what it means in terms of, it's kind of another, just another iteration of conquest. So that is, which again I think is an important one, even to rethink of sometimes how we historicize neoliberalism, as if it were just a kind of temporally limited process, when there's other ways, and I think very important ways of understanding it as just one iteration in ongoing processes of colonial dispossession. So the case of Zapatismo, and I look at the work of a media artist who works, is kind of part of the Otra Campaña and does work in that vein. And I'm interested in it because it's this experimental transmedial kind of a translation of a lot of this imaginary of Zapatismo into the level of an alternate reality game. But then I think at the same level, the cultural production of the Zapatistas themselves is like hugely important for that. I mean, the whole archive of texts that they've produced, I think, has really theorized what neoliberalization has meant and what resistance to it can look like, and has been really important globally for that. And I think that's another really good example. I don't think it's a defensive project at all. It's an absolutely the construction of other ways of living, other forms of doing politics, other forms of production, alternate economies. I think it's one among many examples, but I think a particularly important one.
Yes, I'd like to come back on the question of the transnational and more particularly on the articulation between the local scale and the more global scale. I know very few about the artistic practices and social movements you talk about, but in my research, I also work on anti-capitalist social movements, and they are very localized. And more specifically, the question of the local becomes the object of the conflict, and in return it shapes the space, the spatial practices, but also collective identities of these specific spaces. But on the other hand, they do also produce global discourses on capitalism or the protection of the environment. And so I was wondering, how do you, in your work, articulate the two, or maybe it's not the question.
Yeah. Well, I think, because I do think that they are, in all of these cases, they are articulated. So there's, I'll give you one example that I think is maybe illustrates why I think that making that connection is really important. So one, I also do a lot of work on Latino politics in the U.S. and Latino cultural production in the U.S. And one of the examples from my book is this project that produces kind of counter memorials, unofficial guerrilla memorials to that talk about the kind of erased histories of subaltern Latinos in Los Angeles. And that might be things about, a community that was displaced, an arrival point for migrants in downtown LA. But what's really important, I think, is that, so on one hand, these are very local phenomena. It's talking about, a neighborhood, what it means, for example, the displacement of a very specific Chicano neighborhood in Los Angeles. And they're local histories and local identities, right? But really, to understand those processes, a transnational perspective is incredibly valuable, because you can't really understand the formation of Latino identities in the U.S. without understanding the causes of migration, without understanding U.S. imperialism, without understanding the state policies that have been undertaken, by Latin American states that have enabled, migration, without understanding the U.S.'s, wars against Latin American countries. All of those things. So that, and I think it's. Politically, it's really important to have that perspective also. This is really demonstrated, I think, when speaking about U.S. Latino politics, because in the case of, thinking that these are, for one, thinking that there's homogeneous identities, that basically is just kind of production, very recent production of U.S. political cultures, even talk about a kind of homogeneous Latino identity. Doesn't make sense from a perspective that takes seriously, actually takes seriously the histories and cultures of the Americas. But for two, I think specifically when we're talking about migration and migrants, a transnational perspective is so important, because you can have the formation of local identities, but those are, and important to understand localized struggles, but those are really one aspect of these transnational processes, be it kind of migration, of people being forced to leave because of economic policies, etc. And that dimension, the very fact that dimension is always missing from so much of the many debates, for example, in the U.S. on migration, I think has kind of enormous political ramifications, right? So that's, I think, just that's one example.
And so this is about in the context in which those struggles emerge, but what about also how they rely with each other? Do
Yeah.
For example, one struggle use the struggle of another location to nourish their own practices? And is there like a network? Are they organized in a way, or how do
Yeah.
they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you could talk about, for example, with the human rights movements, use of escraches, that happens all over Latin America, and there's plenty of kind of communication between these movements from different places. But then, I mean, again, go back to the case study that I have looking at the art practice that's articulated with Zapatismo, which of course has a very important local inscription and has hyper-local kind of, in some respects, but is also has a national project and an international project. In that case, the one important element is the solidarity economies of Zapatista coffee. And so you have production cooperatives run by indigenous peasants in Chiapas, who the very fact that they produce autonomously, and then they have these international or transnational or translocal, whatever you want to call them, networks of distribution and circulation of this product that they produce, is really important for them to be able to continue continue living and stay on their land in Chiapas. So I think that's one example where you do have, and in the case of the project that I'm looking at, is an artist who basically integrates that solidarity economy into his art practice and takes it to Europe, takes it to New York, and has a kind of performative element to it, but then there's a really important material element where he basically, makes his solidarity with the movement material by participating in this economy that materially supports them. I think that's one example.
I might just pick up one of the central leitmotifs that you have in this piece is on the aesthetics of history and what you call the kind of counter-hegemonic aesthetics of history. And it might be helpful to flesh out what exactly that means. At one point you define it as historical production is a sense-making mechanism. Mm-hmm. And so it gives us a sense of what has happened, what could happen, etc. Why is it that why do you use the terminology of aesthetics in that regard? Like, what is it that lends to an understanding of history, as opposed to, for instance, many people will talk about, well, there's the dominant history and there's subaltern history, or there's visible history and invisible history, or the history of bankers and the history of the vanquished. What is it about, and this might relate to some of these other questions, just relating these kind of geographic questions of the local and the transnational to historical questions. What is it about aesthetics per se that allows you to think history in a way that might be a little bit different than some of those models?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think about it something that includes a discursive level but goes beyond that. So how it really affects, it works on us, really in producing us as subjects, a sense of history. In terms of what we can perceive, what we feel, how we even think about temporality and the past and the future, and how, if these are related, how they're related, if they exist together, if they exist linearly. Like, these, I think, are kind of really fundamental questions that aren't always captured by when we talk just about discourses or we talk about narratives. Right. And how they're, working at the level of perception, of affect, of desire, things like that. And there's even what is perceived as historical or worthy of being historicized. I think that's a big, that itself is a question, or I think there's an aesthetics to how we would even recognize that, and how we're programmed to think that history is, for example, monumental in certain senses, and that there's all kinds of other practices and lives that sort of are not wouldn't be recorded, wouldn't even be thought about, wouldn't be narrated as relating to kind of a sense of historicity. So that's what I'm trying to get at, this kind of more capacious sense of how history forms us.
Yeah, I have two questions, but first of all, I really like the piece and I can't wait for the book. I'm really looking forward to it. And one is the question
Just a little louder for the back of the room, sorry.
One is the question of guerrilla cultural warfare, and it's like the connection with the Zapatistas is quite imminent, but I'm wondering, vis-a-vis the scratching, if there is also a tracing of the history of what was the guerrilla response to the dictatorship, and if there's a connection between like contemporary scratches back to what the insurgency was doing at that time, or if that connection is more broken, more unstable, and also in other places, like even that you speak broadly as guerrilla warfare, in which, contexts in which perhaps the contestation of the state is not as explicit as it is in Zapatismo, where you have taken municipalities and like a very clear, but in which like the mobility with state forces is perhaps more permeable or more, there are connections that are more transitory, rather than fully antagonistic in the guerrilla sense. And the second question is about something that you mentioned, that it is in EHESS to some degree, but it's this working with archives that have included the erasure in the very ways in which they record something. And that aesthetically one has to somehow undo the archive itself, or the violence of the archive itself in silencing. And I wonder if that doesn't get to why also emphasizing aesthetics and counter history. So those two questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great question. In terms of the connection to the guerrilla in these cases, I think on one hand, I'm using the term more broadly in the way that people talk about guerrilla art practices, right? So a lot of this stuff is work that people do in public space. It's often, in some cases it's illegal. It's a lot. On one hand, I'm using that to index a certain mode of production that we talk about when we talk about guerrilla cultural practices, which I think is again really important to this idea of them being extra-institutional or counter-institutional. Just as an example, on one hand, you have the difference between an escrache and petitioning the state to deliver justice. You also have the difference between, in the case of the Society for Erased History that I was talking about, the difference between, going to a state museum of cultural heritage and talking to them about being more inclusive of Latino histories versus going and marking the sites yourself and making your own practice of kind of public history that's from the bottom up. So that's part of the way I'm using it. In the terms of the relationship in the Argentine, the human rights movement to the insurgent movements, it's a really complicated question because I think on one hand people would say, well, that link is broken. This is not a revolutionary movement, and Argentina had a really significant urban guerrilla movement and really significant state repression, that decimated, they just, exterminated that movement. But there is a kind of a really important vindication of that struggle that exists, of the revolutionary struggle that exists within certain sectors of the human rights movement. And I think that's part of the thing that I'm interested in, where you have, people who are part of it, and it's not just about commemorating those who died, but really recognizing why they died, why they had to be killed in order for politics to take the route that it did, but then, claiming that struggle as a valuable one and one that should be continued. And not every aspect of the human rights movement does that, but there are really important tendencies within it that do. and that would say, well, this is really about carrying that forward. Of course, in a totally different historical conjuncture where the possibilities are quite different, the tactics are quite different, but I think at least in the level of a kind of ideological level, or kind of maintaining that investment in that political imaginary against all odds, that is something I think is really valuable. The other question about marking, kind of having to somehow undo the erasures. I think that's absolutely. I think both undo those erasures, make them visible. I think there's a huge part of the projects that I'm interested in, why I'm also talking about aesthetics of history, that is on one hand about putting forth erased histories, but also making visible the kind of composition of history as a project of domination, and showing how that works. That is also, I think, essential to these. In some ways, you could say that. I mean, some people talk about this as not, as kind of marking the silences, marking the places where silencing happens, or the kind of marginalization of certain histories, or where visibilization is itself a project of domination, right? Because I don't want to, and this is something that I think oftentimes we talk about, and I myself have often talked about kind of what is erased and what is made visible, but I think it's actually much more complicated, the way that kind of the composition of ideas of history work, because sometimes visibility is not actually according power to these projects. Sometimes it's a kind of perversion or a capture or a delimitation. And I think that's very much the case. When we talk about the culturalist reduction of certain radical projects as a kind of neutralization that operates through historical discourse. I think that's one example of it. So I think that it is about looking at silences, but it's also how we have to kind of maybe develop even more of a vocabulary for talking about all of the contours, the way that works. That's not kind of just with that presence, absence, visible, invisible. Does that make sense?
Well, we're almost at the end of our time. If there are any really pressing and urgent questions, then jump in quickly. Otherwise, maybe join me in thanking Jennifer for coming in and chatting.